I've been hopeless and shattered searching for my mom since I was born.
Shh, it's okay. Don't cry. Everything is going to be fine now, I promise.
He stopped, just as the woman in rags lifted her face toward him. Not just any beggar. A woman the entire street mocked, avoided, and feared. A woman who wandered barefoot, talking to ghosts only she could hear. He wasn't supposed to pass that road that day. He wasn't supposed to notice her trembling hands or her silent tears. But something in her eyes pulled him in. Something painfully familiar. He thought he was helping a stranger. Just a mad woman abandoned by the world. But the moment he touched her shoulder, something ancient inside him shifted. Because this wasn't charity. This wasn't coincidence. This was blood calling out to blood. Now he's not just a good Samaritan. He's a son standing before a mother he never knew. A mother broken by secrets he was never told. And in that moment his entire life stopped making sense. Because the woman everyone rejected is the woman who once held him as a baby. And finding her means uncovering the truth that destroyed their family. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ocean of Tales. Kindly like, comment, and subscribe on this channel. We will be notifying you when we drop a new video. Don't forget to tell us where you are watching from. The day began like any other, with Tobi weaving his way through Lagos traffic, one hand on the steering wheel, the other tapping the horn in rhythm with his thoughts. Heat shimmered above the cars, danfos yelled for passengers, and street hawkers moved between lanes like restless ghosts. His mind was locked on deadlines, unpaid bills, and a promotion he desperately wanted, not destiny. Yet as he approached his usual junction, a stalled truck blocked the road, forcing him to slow down and choose another route, without knowing that one small turn was about to rewrite his entire life. He turned into the narrow side street with mild irritation, tires bumping over broken edges of asphalt, the city suddenly feeling tighter, more intimate. The smell changed too. Less exhaust, more dust, fried plantain, and something damp and old that clung to forgotten corners. Tobi glanced around, trying to remember when last he had taken this path, or if he ever had. Everything felt strangely new, yet faintly familiar, like a dream he'd almost remembered. As he drove deeper, the noise of the main road faded, replaced by a quiet that felt heavy, as if it was waiting. He parked near a row of tired, peeling shops, engine ticking as it cooled, his mind still on errands and time. He only intended to grab something small from a kiosk and get back on track. But as he stepped out of the car, the air hit him differently, thicker, slower, carrying a soft murmur of voices and distant laughter. The light seemed slightly dimmer on this street, shadows stretching longer than they should. Tobi locked his car, took a few steps forward, and felt an odd tug in his chest he couldn't explain. He walked past a cluster of women selling fruits, their eyes tracking him briefly, then drifting away, uninterested. Children ran barefoot, chasing a plastic bottle like a ball, their laughter sharp against the dull walls. A radio crackled from somewhere, playing an old gospel song that his late grandmother used to hum on Sunday mornings. The melody slid under his skin, stirring a memory he couldn't catch. He slowed down without realizing, his footsteps syncing with the beat, his senses sharpening. Something in this street felt like a place his soul recognized, even if his mind did not. He noticed the change in atmosphere before he saw her. Conversations dipped for a moment, eyes flickered toward the far end of the road, and then quickly away, as if afraid to linger. The fruit seller stopped mid-gesture. A boy who had been laughing grew quiet, hugging his bottle closer. It was subtle, but it rippled through the space like a cold wind. Tobi followed their half-hidden glances, curiosity rising, wondering what kind of presence could shift the energy of an entire street without saying a word. He heard her before he fully saw her. Soft muttering, like someone talking to shadows, words spilling in half-formed sentences only she understood. At the edge of the pavement, near a crumbling wall stained by years of rain, a thin figure sat hunched over, wrapped in mismatched rags that barely kept out the world. Bare feet rested on the bare ground, toes coated in dust. Her hair clung to her forehead in tangled strands, and her hands moved slowly, drawing invisible patterns in the air, as if rewriting a story no one had cared to read. He tried to look away, the way everyone else did, but something locked his gaze in place. As he drew closer, the noise of Lagos blurred into a distant hum, and it felt like the whole street stepped back, leaving just him and this forgotten woman suspended in an invisible circle. His heart beat harder, not from fear, but from a strange, uninvited ache he didn't understand. He told himself he would just walk past, mind his business, continue his day. But then, at the exact moment he drew level with her, the woman in rags slowly lifted her face toward him. He froze mid-step as her face tilted fully into the light, revealing eyes that should have been empty, yet were not. They shimmered with something raw, something bruised, something painfully human. Her pupils trembled, as if recognizing a shape her mind could not hold. Toby felt the air squeeze around him, the world narrowing until it was only those eyes and the strange echo they stirred inside him. He tried to blink the feeling away, but the pull only tightened, urging him to look closer, even as his heartbeat stumbled. He shifted his weight nervously, pretending to adjust the strap of his bag, but his gaze remained trapped in hers. Her eyes carried a broken softness he had seen once. Long ago, in a forgotten memory he never revisited. They weren't wild like the rumors said. They weren't empty like madness should be. They were searching for something lost, something stolen. And the way they trembled made him wonder if that something was him. His chest tightened with a confusion that felt too sharp to ignore. He turned slightly, hoping distance would break the strange connection, but her gaze clung to him with the fragile desperation of someone drowning. She lifted a shaky hand halfway toward him, not fully reaching, not fully retreating. Her fingers trembled like they had held a baby once, long before the world crashed over her. Toby clenched his palm as a phantom warmth flickered through his nerves, like a memory of a touch he didn't recall receiving. The sensation startled him, pushing him deeper into an emotional fog. He tried to rationalize everything. Maybe he was projecting, maybe compassion was tricking his mind. But the more he studied her, the more unnerved he became. A faint scar above her eyebrow, the curve of her cheekbones, even the way her shoulders curled inward reminded him of old family pictures he had glimpsed in childhood but never paid attention to. Details he once dismissed now resurfaced with unsettling clarity. He swallowed hard, wondering why a complete stranger felt like a ghost from his forgotten past. He stepped closer without fully deciding to, drawn by a force that felt older than his own name. Her eyes widened as he approached, softening with a recognition she shouldn't have, but undeniably did. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but only a shaky breath escaped. She leaned forward slightly, studying him the way a mother studies a child she fears she may never see again. The warmth in her gaze unsettled him more than madness ever could. It felt intentional. It felt personal. He noticed a flicker in her expression, fear mixed with hope, as though she sensed something she wasn't allowed to believe. Her gaze dropped briefly to the side of his neck, lingering exactly where his childhood birthmark was hidden beneath his shirt. The precision of her focus sent a chill racing down his spine. How could she possibly know to look there? His hand instinctively moved to his collar as if protecting something sacred, and the gesture made her flinch with heartbreaking familiarity, like she'd seen it before. He stepped back, breath unsteady, realizing he was no longer facing a random street beggar. He was facing a question he wasn't ready to answer. A question hiding in her trembling eyes, begging him to remember what he had never been told. And the more he resisted, the more his soul whispered a truth his mind refused to accept. Why does she look at you like she once carried you in her arms? Toby tore his gaze away for a moment, hoping the world around him would steady his thoughts. But as he stepped back, he noticed how the street itself reacted to the woman, how people's eyes darted toward her with quick, nervous glances before sliding away. A fruit seller pulled her child closer. Two teenagers crossed to the opposite side of the road, their laughter dying mid-sentence. Fear rippled through the air like an unseen warning, tightening the atmosphere around her broken silhouette. Tobi felt the weight of their avoidance pressing against his chest. He walked a few steps toward the nearest shop, trying to blend into the crowd, but whispers rose behind him like rising smoke. Low, sharp, and cold. They spoke her name with disgust, twisting it into something cursed. Someone muttered she was dangerous. Another claimed she carried bad luck. A third whispered that madness was contagious if you stared too long. The words slithered between the people, creating a barrier thicker than any wall. Tobi felt each whisper like a hand tugging him away from her, urging him to return to the safe, predictable world he knew. He turned slightly and saw an old woman watching the ragged figure with a mix of pity and fear. She shook her head slowly, murmuring that the street had given up on the mad woman long ago. Her voice carried a bitterness shaped by years of judgment. She said the woman had once been beautiful, once had a life, once had a child, but the details twisted as they passed from mouth to mouth, losing truth along the way. Tobi felt a sting in his chest at that word, child. He moved closer to an idle group of mechanics leaning against a shop wall. Their conversation shifted abruptly when they noticed the direction of his gaze. One of them spat on the ground, saying the woman had been abandoned for a reason. People don't dump someone unless she's done something terrible. Their casual cruelty made Tobi's jaw tighten. Their certainty felt rehearsed, like something they'd repeated for years to justify their silence. But beneath their mockery, he sensed fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of the truth. He stepped away from the crowd, needing space to breathe. The whispers followed him like shadows, each one painting her as a monster, a curse, an outcast. But when he glanced back at her, he didn't see a creature to fear. He saw a woman alone, shivering in rags, clinging to fragments of memories the world forced her to forget. She didn't threaten the street threatened her. The realization twisted something inside him, resurfacing the strange pull he couldn't ignore. He watched as a little boy ran too close, and his mother yanked him back with unnecessary force, eyes flashing with panic. The boy stared at the ragged woman with innocent curiosity, but the mother's grip tightened, dragging him away as if danger lived in the air around her. The harshness of it struck Tobi deeply, how even innocence was coached to fear her presence. How the world taught people to hate what they didn't understand. He looked back at the woman one more time, taking in how she shrank under the weight of their judgment, her shoulders folding inward as though trying to hide from eyes that saw only madness. And as he watched her silently suffer in the middle of a street that had erased her humanity, a new question formed inside him. What kind of pain turns a whole community against one woman, and why does it feel like her pain is connected to his? Tobi moved toward her without fully deciding to, his steps slow and cautious, like approaching a fragile creature the world had already broken too many times. The street noise dimmed behind him, replaced by the faint rustle of her breathing and the soft scrape of her fingers against the dusty ground. Her shoulders twitched at every sound, yet when she sensed him near, she stilled, almost as if she'd been waiting. His heart tightened at that stillness, unsure why it felt so personal, like walking toward a memory he didn't know he'd lost. He knelt slightly, lowering himself to her level, letting instinct guide him before logic could interfere. The closer he got, the clearer her trembling became, her hands fluttering like torn leaves caught in wind. Something in her quiet suffering struck a chord deep inside him, stirring a warmth he didn't expect. He reached out tentatively, intending only to give comfort, maybe offer water or help her sit properly. But the motion felt heavier, as though carried by something older than him, older than the street, older than the life he thought he knew. His fingers brushed her shoulder gently, expecting her to flinch or recoil, but instead her entire body froze, as if the world had stopped spinning. Her breath hitched, and her eyes widened in a way that wasn't fear. It was recognition. A raw, unfiltered recognition that punched straight into his chest. For a moment, she didn't seem mad. She didn't seem lost. She seemed found. The sudden clarity in her gaze rattled him, breaking through every barrier he had built around the idea of who she was. She lifted her hand slowly, almost painfully, and placed it over his, her touch feather-light but charged with something ancient and electric. The connection sent a tremor through both of them. Her fingertips traced the back of his hand as though memorizing something familiar, something she had once held long before life shattered her mind. Toby felt a strange warmth flood his arm, an echo of belonging he couldn't explain.
It was terrifying.
It was comforting. It was impossible to ignore. Her lips quivered as she leaned closer, her eyes locked on his with a tenderness that shouldn't exist between strangers. She whispered a sound, broken, fragile, but unmistakably shaped like a name. A name that only two people in the world had ever called him. His breath snagged in his throat as the syllables drifted through the air, thin as thread but sharp enough to cut through years of forgotten truth. He pulled back slightly, fear and confusion crashing together. She reached forward again, her hand trembling harder now, as if fighting some invisible force inside her. Her eyes darted across his face like she was searching for proof, for confirmation that her heart hadn't lied. And when her gaze landed on the faint outline of the birthmark beneath his collarbone, her entire body shuddered. Tears spilled down her cheeks, not wild tears, not incoherent tears, but tears of someone recognizing her own soul in another's face. Toby staggered back, breath ragged, mind spinning from the weight of her reaction. Her trembling intensified, her fingers clawing softly at the air as if trying not to lose him again. He stared at her, chest hammering, unable to deny the truth rising between them. Whatever madness the world said she carried, this moment wasn't part of it. Something ancient had awakened between them, something blood-deep and undeniable. And the question echoed louder than ever inside him. Why does her touch feel like home? Toby stepped back, trying to steady his breath, but the world around him wavered like heat rising off asphalt. His shirt collar shifted as he moved, revealing the faint curve of the birthmark on his upper chest, the one he'd always thought was just a random stain of fate. The woman's eyes locked onto it instantly, her trembling stopping as though someone had pressed pause on her entire existence. She leaned forward, neck stretching with desperate recognition, and the air thickened with a tension he could almost taste, salt, dust, and something ancient breaking open. She reached toward his collar with a slow, aching motion, fingers quivering as though approaching a sacred artifact. Toby instinctively pulled back, but she kept inching forward, her gaze glued to the mark like it was the last piece of a puzzle she'd been trapped inside for years. Her breath hitched sharp and fast, her lips forming a sob that didn't fully escape. The intensity in her eyes shifted from confusion to certainty, and Toby felt panic spike inside him. Her stare wasn't random. She knew that birthmark. She recognized it. He swallowed hard, memory fragments he didn't remember having flashing behind his eyes. An old photograph he saw once, a woman smiling with a baby on her lap, a hand touching a tiny birthmark. He had dismissed it back then, thinking it meant nothing. But now the image clawed its way into his mind, refusing to stay buried. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he looked at her again, wondering how a stranger's reaction could feel more truthful than anything he'd lived with his whole life. She suddenly pressed her palm over her own chest, right where his birthmark sat on his body. Her movements were slow, intentional, heavy with meaning. Tears streamed down her face as she rocked slightly, mouthing silent words, her shoulders shaking with the weight of everything she couldn't say. Toby watched her in stunned silence, his body frozen as her gestures echoed something he had seen before. But where? And when? The familiarity gnawed at him like an old bruise touched for the first time in years. The street fell into an uncanny quiet, as if the moment demanded reverence. Even the children stopped playing. The fruit seller paused mid-sale. The mechanic who had been laughing earlier grew still. All eyes shifted between Toby and the woman, sensing something seismic unfolding, but not understanding what it meant. Toby felt the weight of their collective silence pressing into his spine, turning him into the center of a story he didn't know he belonged to. He hated how exposed he suddenly felt. She inched closer again, reaching my hands out for him with trembling urgency. Her fingers barely brushed the edge of his shirt, but the gesture shattered whatever distance he had tried to maintain. Her hand hovered over his heart, trembling violently now, as though fighting to stay in the present long enough to claim a truth she'd been robbed of. And when her fingers finally grazed the fabric over his birthmark, she collapsed into a sob so raw it split the air around them. Tobi staggered backward, fear, confusion, and disbelief slamming together inside him like crashing waves. His mind screamed for logic, but his body remembered something older than memory. Something his spirit recognized even before his brain could catch up. He stared at her shaking form, unable to move, unable to run, unable to breathe fully. And as the truth loomed over him like a shadow he couldn't escape, one terrifying thought rooted itself in his mind. What if this woman wasn't reacting to madness, but to her child she once held and lost? Tobi stumbled back from her, desperate for distance, but the world behind him felt just as unstable. He pressed a hand against a nearby wall, trying to steady his racing breath. The street watched in stunned silence, every pair of eyes waiting for his next move. His mind spiraled through memories, birthdays, school days, moments he once believed were simple. But now they all felt polluted, as if someone had stitched his childhood together with needles dipped in lies. He wondered how many of his memories were real, and how many were constructed to keep him blind. He turned away abruptly and began walking fast, almost running, his footsteps crunching against gravel. The woman called out with a broken cry that shattered something inside him, but he forced himself forward. He needed answers, not guesses. He needed truth, not emotion. The air grew heavier as he neared the car, each breath thick with dread. A part of him hoped the connection he felt was a mistake, a coincidence, an illusion, anything but reality. But the weight in his chest whispered otherwise. He couldn't outrun the truth rising behind him. He jumped into the car and slammed the door, the interior suddenly suffocating. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he replayed her reaction, her touch, her tears. He remembered something. The mark on his chest wasn't just a birthmark. As a child, his aunt once said it was the last thing his mother left him. He had laughed, thinking it was a joke. Now the memory clawed at him, sharp and unforgiving. Why had she said that? Why did no one ever talk about his mother again? The silence around her had always been too perfect. He sped away from the street, tires screeching like a scream he was too afraid to release. His childhood home wasn't far, a gated compound filled with polished tiles, neat flowers, and secrets buried under smiles. As he drove, flashes of his father's firm voice echoed in his mind, subtle warnings. Don't ask about your mother. Let the past stay buried. He always thought it was grief. Now it felt like control. A cold chill crept through his spine, whispering that he'd grown up in a carefully crafted illusion. When he arrived, he stormed into the house with a force he didn't know he carried. The living room smelled of furniture polish and old lies. His aunt, the woman who raised him after his father's sudden death, sat quietly with a newspaper. Her eyes widened the moment she saw him, recognizing the storm in his face. She straightened too quickly, like someone caught hiding evidence. Tobi felt anger sharpen his breath. She knew something. She had always known. And now he was ready to tear the truth out of the walls if he had to. He confronted her with a trembling urgency, asking about the birthmark, the woman on the street, his mother, every question spilling out like boiling water. She froze, lips quivering, eyes darting to the door as though hoping someone would rescue her from this moment. The silence stretched thin, threatening to snap. Then her shoulders slumped, and guilt washed over her face like a confession waiting to happen. Tobi's stomach twisted. He had never seen her look afraid. What kind of secret could terrify a grown woman? She finally whispered something soft, something shaky, something that ripped the ground open beneath him. Your mother was never dead. The words punched the air out of his lungs. His legs weakened, his vision blurred. Every memory he had ever trusted collapsed into dust. He stared at her, shaking, realizing that the life he had lived, the life he'd believed, was built on deception. And the most terrifying part wasn't the lie itself, but what else they had hidden from him. His aunt's confession cracked open the silence of the room, but what followed was worse than any lie he had imagined. She sank slowly into a chair, fingers trembling as though touching old scars she'd buried too deep. Tobi stood frozen, waiting, fearing, bracing. Her eyes glossed over as she reached into the past, into memories she clearly wished had stayed dead. The tension in the room thickened, heavy enough to choke on. He could feel truth circling, ready to strike. She began unraveling the story in broken pieces, painting a picture of a young woman whose love had glowed brighter than anything Tobi had ever known. His mother wasn't a ghost or a rumor. She was once vibrant, gentle, and fiercely devoted to her newborn son. Tobi felt his knees weaken at the image of her holding a baby version of him, whispering lullabies the world had long forgotten. But her voice faltered when she described the storm that followed. A marriage trapped between love and the poisonous disapproval of powerful in-laws. His father's family hadn't seen her as suitable. They whispered behind closed doors, questioning her background, twisting her kindness into weakness. When Tobi was born, their resentment grew sharper. His mother became a target, not for what she did, but for who she was. His aunt described nights filled with silent battles and mornings bruised with tension. Tobi felt his heart break for a woman he barely remembered, yet somehow deeply felt connected to. How much had she endured before everything shattered? The turning point came like a knife in the dark. One night, after an explosive argument fueled by jealousy and control, his father's family launched a plan that would destroy her forever. They framed her mental state, twisting her exhaustion and postpartum stress into evidence of instability. They claimed she was dangerous, unfit, a threat to her own baby. Tobi's hands curled into fists as the words settled. She had been fighting alone while everyone else sharpened blades behind her back. His aunt's voice cracked when she explained how the baby, Tobi, was taken from her arms. Security guards held her down as she screamed for her child. She begged, fought, shattered, but influence and power drowned her voice. Overnight, she became a woman without rights, without a name, without her son. Tobi felt the weight of her stolen motherhood pressing against his ribs like a crushing stone. He imagined her reaching out into empty air, desperate to hold him again. With no family to defend her and no place to run, she was thrown into the streets under the guise of protecting the child. Her mind broke under the weight of grief, not madness, but heartbreak so violent it tore through her sanity. She wandered the roads searching for him, clutching memories like scraps of fabric. The world called her mad. But she wasn't crazy. She was shattered. Every step she took was a step toward the child they stole. Every whisper she muttered was a lullaby missing its baby. Tobi stood in the center of the room, trembling, overwhelmed by the truth. His mother hadn't abandoned him. She had been hunted, stripped of everything, left to die with only love and loss as her companions. His aunt looked up at him with tears pooling in her eyes, whispering the final blow. They didn't just take you from her, they erased her from your life. And as the words echoed in his mind, one chilling realization rose above everything. He had been living the life they stole from her. Tobi stepped away from his aunt, pacing the room as though the walls were closing in on him. The truth clung to his skin, heavy and suffocating. Every breath he took felt borrowed from a woman who had spent years gasping for her own. His mind replayed her trembling hands, her fragile voice, her broken gaze, and suddenly, none of it looked like madness anymore. It looked like grief sharpened by time, trauma wearing rags, love disfigured by betrayal. He realized he had mistaken survival for insanity, and that realization twisted painfully inside him. He collapsed into a chair, elbows on his knees, fingers pressing into his temples, as if trying to hold his head together. His aunt watched him sadly, but said nothing. Her silence became a canvas for the truth to paint itself on. He saw his mother wandering the streets, not because she was lost, but because she was searching. He saw her muttering to herself, not because she was delusional, but because she was replaying memories the world refused to validate. He saw her flinch at touch, not from fear of people, but from fear of losing someone again. Every strange act suddenly made sense. He remembered how she had stared at him, recognizing something he didn't know he carried. That wasn't madness. That was a mother seeing her child. Tobi's throat tightened with a mixture of rage and sorrow. Rage at those who stripped her identity. Sorrow for every year she wandered alone. The thought of her sleeping on hard ground while he slept in soft sheets made his stomach churn. He had lived in comfort bought by her suffering. The irony cut deep. He stood again, restless, pacing toward the window. Outside, life moved carelessly, cars honking, children laughing, the world rotating with no awareness of the tragedy unfolding in one small living room. Tobi pressed his palm to the glass, the coolness grounding him. He pictured his mother in the rain, soaked and trembling, whispering his name into storm clouds. What the world interpreted as madness was merely her clinging to the last piece of herself that hadn't been stolen. He wasn't sure if he wanted to scream or cry. He thought about mental health, the way African streets turn grief into a joke, trauma into an insult, brokenness into entertainment. People laughed at her, feared her, avoided her, not knowing they were mocking a heart shattered while protecting a child. Shame rippled through him, shame he once viewed her through the same lens. He wondered how many other mad people on the streets were just stories no one bothered to understand. How many broken spirits the world mislabeled because pain doesn't always look like tears. It sometimes looks like chaos. He turned back to his aunt, eyes burning with determination. He needed to see her again. He needed to hold her, speak to her, listen to the fragments of her memory. He needed to give her back the dignity stolen from her by the very people meant to protect her. But he also feared what he might find, what years of abandonment had carved into her soul. The fear of being too late gripped his chest like a fist. What if she no longer recognized him next time? What if the moment they shared was her last fragile spark? He took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside him. An awakening, a purpose, a debt carved into bone. His mother hadn't survived madness. She had survived grief that would have broken anyone. The world had failed her, but he refused to be part of that failure. As he grabbed his keys with trembling resolve, one truth echoed through his mind with painful clarity. He didn't just owe her a visit, he owed her a life she had been robbed of. Tobi rushed out of the house with a force that surprised even him, but the moment he reached the street, doubt hit him like a cold wave. His steps slowed, then faltered entirely, his feet planted on the pavement as if rooted by unseen chains. The truth he carried felt too heavy, too dangerous, too life-changing. Somewhere on a dusty road sat a woman who had spent years searching for him, yet he, her own child, was terrified to return to her. The irony pressed on his chest until he could barely breathe. He leaned against his car, gripping the edge of the door as his heartbeat pounded like fists against a locked door. Questions stormed through his mind. Would she still recognize him? Would she fear him? Would she cling to him so tightly he couldn't escape? Or worse, would she be too far gone to know him anymore? Every possibility felt like a blade pressed to his throat. He wasn't just confronting his mother. He was confronting the version of himself he had been denied, one shaped by love, not lies. The uncertainty twisted his stomach like a knot he couldn't untangle. He climbed into the driver's seat but didn't start the engine. Instead, he stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face looked familiar yet foreign, like someone halfway between two identities, one forged by deceit and one forged by blood. The mirror reflected the ache in his eyes, an ache that didn't exist yesterday, but now overshadowed everything. He wondered how a stranger in rags could make him question his entire existence. How did one encounter destroy the shape of a lifetime? He rested his forehead on the steering wheel, breath shaking, the weight of guilt settling into his bones. He had seen her countless times growing up, on streets, in markets, wandering aimlessly. Yet he never once paused long enough to wonder who she was. Worse, he had looked away like everyone else. That realization slammed into him with brutal force. She had been suffering within reach, and he had walked past her as if she didn't matter. As if her story wasn't tied to his. As if her survival wasn't rooted in remembering him. He finally turned the key, the engine rumbling awake like a heartbeat snapped out of shock. But even as he drove toward the street where he left her, fear stalked him. He feared seeing her broken. He feared seeing her hopeful. But the deepest fear was seeing himself through her eyes, seeing the baby she once held now grown into a man who never knew her name. What kind of son did that make him? The question hung inside him like a rope he didn't know how to climb or cut. The route back felt longer, heavier, as though every street corner carried echoes of a childhood stolen from both of them. He imagined her waiting, rocking slightly, whispering pieces of lullabies as if time hadn't moved. The thought tightened his throat. She had never stopped searching for him, and that loyalty, wounded, ragged, persistent, felt like a debt he could never repay. He wasn't sure he deserved her recognition anymore. He wasn't sure he deserved her at all. When he finally approached the familiar street, his hands trembled so violently he had to grip the steering wheel tighter. The closer he got, the louder the war inside him grew. Love fighting guilt, hope battling fear. And as he slowed near the corner where she had been sitting, his heart slammed against his ribs with one terrifying question. What if he arrived too late, and the mother who knew him no longer remained the same woman he left behind? Toby's car screeched to a halt in front of the family house, gravel spraying under the tires like sparks from an emotional wildfire. He didn't wait for the engine to settle before jumping out, his steps pounding toward the front door with a fury that felt larger than him. Every stride carried the weight of stolen years, broken memories, and a childhood built on someone else's suffering. He pushed the door open so hard it slammed against the wall, shaking the frames hanging beside it. He wasn't just coming home, he was coming for the truth. His uncle stood in the hallway, startled, his expression tightening into an uneasy mix of authority and guilt. The man had always walked with the posture of someone above consequence, but today, his shoulders sagged under the magnitude of Toby's stare. Toby moved closer, breath burning with anger, scanning the house that once felt safe but now felt like a crime scene. The polished floors, the expensive art, the silence hiding behind wealth, it all felt tainted. He suddenly realized how much luxury had been carved out of someone else's pain. He demanded answers, not with calm questions, but with a storm cracking inside him. His voice echoed through the house, ricocheting off walls that held secrets older than he was. His uncle's eyes flickered with panic, revealing a truth before words were even spoken. The man swallowed hard, avoiding Toby's gaze, proving that guilt didn't need a confession to be exposed. Toby felt his pulse thicken, knowing he was closer than ever to breaking the illusion. His aunt entered the room next, her hands shaking, her eyes already drenched in helpless shame. She whispered his name like a prayer, but it only sharpened his anger. He stepped back, stunned by how the two people he trusted most now stood before him like frightened culprits. They had fed him comfort while his mother wandered the streets in torment. He saw their trembling as acknowledgement. They weren't just protectors, they were gatekeepers of a lie. The truth poured out in broken pieces. How the family manipulated his father, how they painted his mother as unstable, how they called in doctors to twist her grief into madness. His uncle admitted to signing the papers that took her freedom. The words struck like punches. Toby felt something tear inside him. A thread tying him to this house snapping in the most painful way. Every explanation sounded like an excuse carved out of cowardice. He stormed deeper into the house, needing space to breathe, needing distance from the people who had stolen everything sacred from him. Memories of his childhood blurred around him. Birthdays, celebrations, school mornings, each one now tainted. He touched the staircase railing, remembering climbing it as a boy with joy, unaware his mother cried in the streets outside. Rage tightened his jaw. The house felt smaller, darker, uglier. He realized he didn't know this home at all. He turned back to face them one last time. His voice was quieter now, but colder. He declared he would not remain part of their legacy of cruelty. He would not carry a name built on his mother's suffering. His uncle begged him to listen, but Tobi was already walking toward the door, hands shaking, heart breaking, steps trembling with truth. As he stepped outside, one fear hovered over all others. Would his mother even want him once she learned he grew up in the house that destroyed her? Tobi drove back toward the street where he'd left her, the steering wheel damp beneath his trembling palms. But this time, he wasn't powered by confusion. He was driven by a purpose carved out of pain. Every bump on the road rattled memories that never belonged to him, memories he should have shared with her. When he pulled over, he rushed out of the car, scanning the roadside with frantic eyes. For a terrifying moment, she was nowhere in sight. His breath caught, panic clawing up his throat like a scream he couldn't release. Then he saw her, huddled beside the same crumbling wall, rocking gently, clutching the torn edge of her clothing like it was the last thread keeping her alive. Her eyes lifted at the sound of his footsteps, dim at first, then flickering with recognition. She reached out before she fully processed he was real. Tobi walked toward her slowly, each step careful, afraid his presence might shatter her again. But when he knelt before her, something inside her steadied, as if his return stitched a broken piece of her soul back into place. He reached for her hands, gently this time, not as a rescuer, but as a son reclaiming what was taken from both of them. Her fingers trembled under his touch, but they didn't pull away. Instead, she tightened her grip, an instinct, a memory, a claim. For the first time, she looked at him without fear, without confusion. Something settled in her gaze, something ancient, something maternal. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes long before she found the strength to speak. Her voice came out cracked and fragile, like wind moving through broken glass. But beneath the trembling, there was clarity. Painful, beautiful clarity. She whispered fragments of a name she once sang over his crib, the lullaby she hummed as she fed him, the last moment she held him before they tore him away. Each word unraveled a thread from years of silence, revealing the mother hidden beneath the ruins of trauma. Her memories spilled out, not in order, not perfectly, but loaded with emotion that needed no translation. Tobi felt his chest fracture as her truth spilled into his hands. She spoke of nights she wandered roads searching for him, calling his name into empty air. She spoke of mornings when she woke believing she'd hear his cry, only to find her arms empty. She spoke of the moment her mind began slipping, not from madness, but from heartbreak too big for a human body to carry. Each confession sliced through him, leaving him breathless with guilt and awe. He realized she hadn't just survived, she had endured for him. He held her closer, letting her tears fall onto his shirt, his arms forming the shield she never had. For the first time in years, she wasn't speaking to shadows. She was speaking to her son. And every word she whispered stitched her back into herself, slowly rebuilding the identity they tried to erase. She rested her forehead against his, breathing him in as if memorizing the scent she'd missed for a lifetime. In that fragile, trembling moment, the world around them faded. The street, the whispers, the shame. All that remained was a broken woman finally heard and a son finally awakened. Yet even as they clung to each other, another question hovered in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. Now that he had found her truth, what would he do to restore the life she lost? Tobi lifted her gently from the ground, feeling how light she was, light like someone who had carried too much suffering for too many years. Her body leaned into his, as if recognizing the embrace it had been denied. As he held her, a realization washed over him. No matter how life had twisted their paths, his arms still felt like home to her. The weight of that truth tightened his throat. He stood slowly, mother cradled against his chest, and for the first time, He felt the full meaning of blood, how it calls, how it remembers, how it heals. He began walking toward his car, her fragile fingers curling around his shirt as if anchoring herself to reality. People on the street paused to watch, a mix of shock, curiosity, and sudden silence filling the air. For years they had mocked her, feared her, labeled her. But now they saw something different, a son carrying a mother they all abandoned. Shame flickered through the crowd like a shadow moving across faces. Toby didn't care. Let them watch. Let them witness what love looked like when stripped of pride, judgment, and comfort. He opened the car door with care, laying her gently inside. She looked up at him with the eyes of a woman rediscovering her own humanity. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead, noticing how her breathing slowed under his touch. He promised himself silently, no more streets, no more cold nights, no more wandering alone. Her suffering ended today. She had lost everything for him once. He would spend the rest of his life giving everything back to her. A vow formed in his chest, quiet but unbreakable. He drove away from the street that stole her sanity, the mirrors reflecting walls she would never have to lean against again. As the road stretched before them, she watched the passing scenery with a distant wonder, like a child learning the world anew. Toby glanced at her often, memorizing the curve of her face, the softness returning to her eyes, the slow rebuilding of her spirit. He realized recovery wouldn't be quick, but it was possible. Love was a better medicine than any prescription. And he had enough love to rebuild an entire life. He took her to a safe place, a quiet home away from noise, judgment, and memories sharp enough to cut. He washed her face, wrapped her in clean clothes, and sat beside her as she rested. As minutes turned to hours, she looked at him again, with growing clarity. Her murmurs became coherent. Her eyes sharpened. Her fingers reached for him, as if recognizing something deeper than sight. And in that fragile whisper of recognition, Toby realized healing wasn't just beginning for her. It was beginning for him too. Days passed. Her mind blossomed slowly into moments of lucidity, moments where she called him my son, with trembling pride. Moments where she remembered lullabies. Moments where she wept for the years stolen. Toby held each moment carefully, storing them like treasures. Their days were not perfect, but they were real, more real than the life he had lived in that polished house of lies. And with each sunrise, the person she once was began to glow through the cracks of who she'd become. One evening, as he sat by her bed, watching her breathe softly, a truth settled over him like a warm blanket. Blood never forgets. Not distance.
Not time.
Not madness. What is born of the heart finds its way home, even through storms meant to erase it. And as he gently held her hand, Toby understood the final lesson of their story. When the world abandons you, love still remembers. When lies bury truth, blood still rises. And when a mother loses everything, a son can bring everything back, piece by piece, heartbeat by heartbeat. Toby woke the next morning to a soft rustle. The kind of sound a frail person makes when adjusting their body carefully, afraid to disturb the fragile peace around them. He found his mother sitting upright on the edge of the bed, fingers tracing the blanket as if exploring a foreign landscape. Her eyes lifted slowly, and though confusion still lingered in their depths, there was a gentleness now, a softness steadily replacing the storm. The sight struck him with a mix of hope and fear. Hope that she was returning to herself, fear that the progress could vanish at any moment. He brewed tea in the small kitchen, the aroma of ginger and honey filling the room with warmth. As he walked back to her, he noticed how her posture straightened slightly, like the smell triggered a distant memory of mornings once filled with the same scent. She accepted the cup with trembling hands, inhaling deeply before taking a small sip. Her eyes watered, not from heat, but from recognition. The simplicity of that moment wrapped around Toby's heart. Healing, he realized, didn't roar. Sometimes it arrived in whispers. After breakfast, he helped her step outside into the small compound, her bare feet touching the concrete cautiously. The sunlight fell softly across her face, revealing the delicate features time had tried to erase. She blinked at the world with the innocence of someone rediscovering life. A breeze lifted her hair, and she closed her eyes, lifting her chin like a flower, leaning toward warmth. Toby watched quietly, knowing the world outside still held shadows. But today she felt safe. Throughout the day, he showed her old photos, baby pictures of himself she had never been allowed to see. She touched each one gently, brushing fingers over the images as though making up for years of missed moments. Sometimes she smiled faintly. Sometimes she gasped softly, memory flickering behind her eyes like a candle fighting to stay lit. And sometimes she cried without sound, tears falling onto the pictures as if returning something precious to the child she once held. Toby spent hours by her side, speaking softly, telling her about his life, his work, his dreams, things he wished she had witnessed. She listened with surprising focus, nodding occasionally, the corners of her lips lifting with maternal pride. But every now and then, she would study him deeply, like trying to stitch together the decades she lost. Those glances pierced him. They carried love. They carried pain. They carried every empty year in between. By evening, she started humming, a melody faint, fragile, but unmistakably familiar. Toby froze. It was the same tune she had whispered on the street, the same one buried in his earliest memories. A lullaby. His lullaby. The sound wrapped around him like an embrace from the past. He knelt beside her and rested his head gently on her lap. She hesitated, then placed a trembling hand on his hair, slowly, almost ceremonially, as if reclaiming a right stolen from her. As night settled and the compound fell quiet, Toby realized something profound. They were not just living together. They were rebuilding each other.
Piece by piece.
Memory by memory. Wound by wound. Their story was no longer defined by what was taken but by what they were choosing to restore. Yet beneath that warmth lingered a faint shadow. What would happen when the world discovered she was back, and that her son now knew the truth they worked so hard to bury? Toby stepped into the compound the next morning with a small bag of groceries, expecting to find his mother resting where he left her. But the moment he pushed open the door, unease tightened around his chest. The room was too still, too quiet. The bed was empty, the blanket tossed aside, and the soft humming she'd begun the day before had vanished. Panic shot through him instantly. He called her name, but the walls swallowed his voice. Every fear he buried came rushing back. Fragile recovery, wandering memory, the danger of the streets. His pulse hammered as he searched corners she couldn't possibly reach. He rushed outside, scanning the compound, eyes darting wildly from one spot to another. Then he saw her near the gate, standing unsteadily, gripping the metal bars as if trying to hold herself upright. She wasn't alone. Two neighbors hovered close, their voices sharp, accusing, uneasy. Their faces twisted with fear, as if her fragile presence threatened the safety of the entire street. Toby felt heat surge through his body. Their expressions weren't curiosity. They were disgust, judgment, assumptions dressed as concern. His mother looked small between them, like a child caught doing something wrong. One of the neighbors gestured angrily, claiming she had been wandering around, implying she didn't belong there. Another muttered that madness attracts danger, eyes narrowing at Toby's house as if evaluating whether to involve the authorities. The words cut through him like knives. He stepped forward quickly, pushing through the tension with a force sharper than his voice. His mother flinched, fear darting across her features, not of him, but of them. The crowd's whispers grew louder, echoing the same tone he heard the day he first found her. Toby positioned himself between her and the neighbors, forming a barrier with his body. His mother's fingers clutched the back of his shirt, trembling with the instinct of someone who had been taken before. He felt her fear, her vulnerability, her silent plea not to be dragged away again. The neighbors backed up slightly, but their disapproval thickened the air. To them, she was still the woman the community rejected. She was still a stigma, still a story told through mockery and fear. They had no idea she was the beating heart he had waited a lifetime to find. He guided her inside, hand firm around hers, but even as he closed the gate, he could feel their eyes burning holes in his back. Judgment didn't fade. It lingered like smoke. He settled her back onto the bed, offering soft reassurances, but she shook violently, whispering fragmented fears. Pieces of old memories resurfacing. She kept asking if they were coming to take him away again, mixing past and present in a way that made Tobi's stomach clench. Her panic made one thing painfully clear. Trauma doesn't disappear when love arrives. It flinches. It hides. It fights shadows. Tobi stayed beside her until her trembling eased, his hand clasped around hers. Yet anger simmered beneath his calm. Anger at a world that refused to see her humanity, at a community that punished her pain, at neighbors who wanted her gone just to protect their comfort. He realized her safety wasn't just about shelter and care. It was about defending her from the same cruelty that broke her mind the first time. And he wasn't going to let history repeat itself. As she finally drifted into exhausted sleep, Tobi stared out the window, jaw clenched, heart burning with resolve. She had survived a world that tried to erase her once. He would not let them pull her into darkness again. But a chilling thought settled into his mind. If the neighborhood already noticed her, how long before the very family that destroyed her learned she was alive?